Welcome to the first installment of Finding Folklore. This video is all about German folktales that I would put into the ghost story category. Personally, I love a good ghost story, not only for that spooky feeling, but because of what they reveal about a culture's relationship with death and the unknown. Within the German tales we'll hear today, there are headless horsemen, zombie monks, a ghostly white lady, and even a tale of being quote-unquote buried alive. It is a fascinating mix of Christian and pagan characters and themes, where even so-called evil spirits try to impart lessons to the living on how to avoid meeting a similar fate. These stories demonstrate traditions like valuing honesty, personal responsibility, resisting greed, and treating others with dignity. I'd love to hear your take on the cultural themes and lessons of these ghost tales down in the comments. Today I'll be reading from Folklore and Legends, Germany, a compilation of tales published in 1892 that can be found on the Project Gutenberg website. Without further ado, let's hear some German ghost stories. The Flaming Castle. Upon a high mountain in the Tyrol, there stands an old castle, in which there burns a fire every night, and the flashes of that fire are so large that they rise up over the walls, and may be seen far and wide. It happened once that an old woman in want of firewood was gathering the fallen twigs and branches upon this castle-crowned mountain, and at length arrived at the castle door. To indulge her curiosity, she began peering about her, and at last entered, not without difficulty, for it was all in ruins and not easily accessible. When she reached the courtyard, there she beheld a goodly company of nobles and ladies, seated and feasting at a huge table. There were likewise plenty of servants who waited upon them, changing their plates, handling round the viands, and pouring out wine for the party. As she thus stood gazing upon them, there came out one of the servants, who drew her on one side and placed a piece of gold in the pocket of her apron, upon which the whole scene vanished in an instant, and the poor frightened old woman was left to find her way back as well as she could. However, she got outside the courtyard, and there stood before her a soldier with a lighted match, whose head was not placed upon his neck, but held by him under his arm. He immediately addressed the old woman and commanded her not to tell anyone what she had seen and heard upon peril of evil befalling her. At length, the woman reached home, full of anguish, still keeping possession of the gold, but telling no one whence she had obtained it. When the magistrates, however, got wind of the affair, she was summoned before them, but she would not speak one word upon the subject, excusing herself by saying that if she uttered one word respecting it, great evil would ensue to her. When, however, they pressed her more strictly, she discovered to them all that had happened to her in the fiery castle, even to the smallest particular. In an instant, almost before her relation was fully ended, she was carried away, and no one could ever learn whither she fled. A year or two afterwards, a young nobleman, a knight, and one well experienced in all things, took up his abode in those parts. In order that he might ascertain the issue of this affair, he set out on foot with his servant in the middle of the night on the road to the mountain. With great difficulty they made the ascent, and were on their way warned 6 times by an unknown voice to desist from their attempt. They kept on, however, heedless of this caution, and at length reached the door of the castle. There again stood the soldier as a sentinel, and he called out as usual, "Who goes there?" The nobleman, who was bold of heart, gave for answer, "It is I." Upon this the spirit inquired further, "Who art thou?" This time the nobleman made no answer, but desired his servant to hand him his sword. When this was done, a black horseman came riding out of the castle, against whom the nobleman would have waged battle. The horseman, however, dragged him upon his horse and rode with him into the courtyard, while the soldier chased the servant down the mountain. The nobleman was never more seen. Hans Jagenteufel. It is commonly believed that if any person is guilty of a crime for which he deserves to lose his head, he will, if he escape punishment during his lifetime, be condemned after his death to wander about with his head under his arm. In the year 1644, a woman of Dresden went out early one Sunday morning into a neighboring wood for the purpose of collecting acorns. In an open space, at a spot not very far from the place which is called the Lost Water, she heard somebody blow a very strong blast upon a hunting horn, and immediately afterwards a heavy fall succeeded. as though a large tree had fallen to the ground. The woman was greatly alarmed and concealed her little bag of acorns among the grass. Shortly afterwards, the horn was blown a second time, and on looking round, she saw a man without a head, dressed in a long gray cloak and riding upon a gray horse. He was booted and spurred, and had a bugle horn hanging at his back. As he rode past her very quietly, she regained her courage, went on gathering the acorns, and when evening came, returned home undisturbed. 9 days afterwards, the woman returned to that spot for the purpose of again collecting the acorns, and she sat down by the forest berg, peeling an apple. She heard behind her a voice calling out to her. "Have you taken a whole sack of acorns, and nobody tried to punish you for doing so?" "No," said she, "the foresters are very kind to the poor, and they have done nothing to me. The Lord have mercy on my sins." With these words she turned about, and there stood he of the grey cloak, but this time he was without his horse, and carried his head, which was covered with curling brown hair, under his arm. The woman shrank from him in alarm, but the spirit said, "You do well to pray to God to forgive you your sins. It was never my good lot to do so." Thereupon he related to her how he had lived about 130 years before, and was called Hans Jagentufel, as his father had been before him, and how his father had often besought him not to be too hard upon poor people, how he had paid no regard to the advice his father had given him, but had passed his time in drinking and carousing, and in all manner of wickedness, for which he was now condemned to wander about the world as an evil spirit. Gaffer Death. There was once a poor man who had 12 children, and he was obliged to labor day and night that he might earn food for them. When at length, as it so happened, a 13th came into the world, the poor man did not know how to help himself, so he ran out into the highway, determined to ask the first person he met to be godfather to the boy. There came stalking up to him Death, who said, "Take me for a godfather." "Who are you?" asked the father. "I am Death, who makes all equal," replied the stranger. Then said the man, "You are one of the right sort. You seize on rich and poor without distinction. You shall be the child's godfather." Death answered, "I will make the boy rich and renowned throughout the world, for he who has me for a friend can want nothing." Said the man, "Next Sunday he will be christened. Mind and come at the right time." Death accordingly appeared as he had promised, and stood godfather to the child. When the boy grew up, his godfather came to him one day and took him into a wood, and said, "Now shall you have your godfather's present. I will make a most famous physician of you. Whenever you are called to a sick person, I will take care and show myself to you. If I stand at the foot of the bed, say boldly, 'I will soon restore you to health,' and give the patient a little herb that I will point out to you, and he will soon be well. If, however, I stand at the head of the sick person, he is mine. Then say, 'All help is useless. He must soon die.'" Then Death showed him the little herb and said, "Take heed that you never use it in opposition to my will." It was not long before the young fellow was the most celebrated physician in the whole world. The moment he sees a person, said everyone, he knows whether or not he'll recover. Accordingly, he was soon in great request. People came from far and near to consult him, and they gave him whatever he required, so that he made an immense fortune. Now it so happened that the king was taken ill, and the physician was called upon to say whether he must die. As he went up to the bed, he saw Death standing at the sick man's head, so there was no chance of his recovery. The physician thought, however, that if he outwitted Death, he would not perhaps be much offended, seeing that he was his godfather, so he caught hold of the king and turned him round, so that by that means Death was standing at his feet. Then he gave him some of the herb, and the king recovered, and was once more well. Death came up to the physician with a very angry and gloomy countenance. "I will forgive you this time for what you have done, because I am your godfather. But if you ever venture to betray me again, you must take the consequences." Soon after this, the king's daughter fell sick, and nobody could cure her. The old king wept night and day until his eyes were blinded, and at last he proclaimed that whosoever rescued her from death should be rewarded by marrying her and inheriting his throne. The physician came, but Death was standing at the head of the princess. When the physician saw the beauty of the king's daughter and thought of the promises the king had made, he forgot all the warnings he had received, and although Death frowned heavily all the while, he turned the patient so that Death stood at her feet, and gave her some of the herb, so that once more he put life into her veins. When Death saw that he was a second time cheated out of his property, he stepped up to the physician and said, "Now, follow me." He laid hold of him with his icy cold hand and led him into a subterranean cave, in which there were thousands and thousands of burning candles ranged in innumerable rows. Some were whole, some half burnt out, some nearly consumed. Every instant some went out, and fresh ones were lighted, so that the little flames seemed perpetually hopping about. "Behold," said Death, "the life candles of mankind. The large ones belong to children, those half-consumed to middle-aged people, and the little ones to the aged. Yet children and young people have oftentimes but a little candle, and when that is burnt out, their life is at an end, and they are mine." The physician said, "Show me my candle." Then Death pointed out a very little candle end, which was glimmering in the socket, and said, "Behold." Then the physician said, "O dearest godfather, light me up a new one, that I may first enjoy my life, be king and husband of the beautiful princess." "I cannot do so," said Death. "One must burn out before I can light up another." "Place the old one then upon a new one, so that that may burn on when this is at an end," said the physician. Death pretended that he would comply with his wish, and reached a large candle, but to revenge himself, purposely failed in putting it up, and the little piece fell and was extinguished. The physician sank with it, so he himself fell into the hands of Death. The Grey Mare and the Garret. In the portal of the Church of Apostles, near the New Market in Cologne, hung a picture, the portraits of a certain Frau Richmondus von Aduct and her 2 children, of whom the following singular story is related. The picture was covered with a curtain, which she worked with her own hands. Her husband, Richmond von Aduct, was in the year of grace 1400 a rich burgomaster of Cologne, and lived at the sign of the Paraquet in the Newmarkt. In that year, a fearful plague desolated all quarters of the city. She fell sick of the pest, and to all appearance died. After the usual period had elapsed, she was buried in the vaults of the Apostles' Church. She was buried, as custom then was, with her jeweled rings on her fingers, and most of her rich ornaments on her person. These tempted the cupidity of the sexton of the church. He argued with himself that they were of no use to the corpse, and he determined to possess them. Accordingly, he proceeded in the dead of night to the vault where she lay interred, and commenced the work of sacrilegious spoliation. He first unscrewed the coffin lid, he then removed it altogether, and proceeded to tear away the shroud which interposed between him and his prey. But what was his horror to perceive the corpse clasp her hands slowly together, then rise, and finally sit erect in the coffin. He was rooted to the earth. The corpse made as though it would step from its narrow bed, and the sexton fled, shrieking through the vaults. The corpse followed, its long white shroud floating like a meteor in the dim light of the lamp, which in his haste he had forgotten. It was not until he reached his own door that he had sufficient courage to look behind him, and then, when he perceived no trace of his pursuer, the excitement which had sustained him so far subsided, and he sank senseless to the earth. In the meantime, Richmond von Aduct, who had slept scarcely a moment since the death of his dear wife, was surprised by the voice of his old manservant, who rapped loudly at his chamber door, and told him to awake and come forth, for his mistress had arisen from the dead, and was then at the gate of the courtyard. "Bah," said he rather pettishly, "go thy ways, Hans, you dream, or are mad, or drunk. What you see is quite impossible. I should as soon believe my old grey mare had got into the garret, as that was my wife at the courtyard gate." Trot, 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 suddenly resounded high over his head. "What's that?" asked he of his manservant. "I know not," replied the man. "And it not be your old grey mare in the garret?" They descended in haste to the courtyard, and looked up to the window of the attic. Lo and behold! There was indeed the grey mare with her head poked out of the window, gazing down with her great eyes on her master and his man, and seeming to enjoy very much her exalted station. and their surprise at it. Knock, 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 went the rapper of the street gate. It is my wife, it is my mistress, exclaimed master and man in the same breath. The door was quickly unfastened, and there, truly, stood the mistress of the mansion, enveloped in her shroud. Are you alive or dead? Exclaimed the astonished husband. Alive, my dear, but very cold, she murmured faintly, her teeth chattering the while, as those of one in a fever chill. Help me to my chamber. He caught her in his arms and covered her with kisses. Then he bore her to her chamber and called up the whole house to welcome and assist her. She suffered a little from fatigue and fright, but in a few days was very much recovered. The thing became the talk of the town, and hundreds flocked daily to see not alone the lady that was rescued from the grave in so remarkable a manner, but also the grey mare which had so strangely contrived to get into the garret. The excellent lady lived long and happily with her husband, and at her death was laid once more in her old resting place. The grey mare, after resting in the garret 3 days, was got down by means of scaffolding, safe and sound. She survived her mistress for some time, and was a general favorite in the city. And when she died, her skin was stuffed and placed in the arsenal as a curiosity. The sexton went mad with the fright he had sustained, and in a short time entered that bourne whence he had so unintentionally recovered the burgomaster's wife. Not only was this memorable circumstance commemorated in the Church of Apostles, but it was also celebrated in bassi-relievi, figures on the wall of the burgomaster's residence, the sign of the paroquet in the Newmarkt. The searcher after antiquities will, however, look in vain for either. They are now not to be found. Modern taste has defaced the porch where stood the one and erected a shapeless structure on the site of the other. The Conclave of Corpses. Some 300 years since, when the convent of Kreutzberg was in its glory, one of the monks who dwelt therein, wishing to ascertain something of the hereafter of those whose bodies lay all undecayed in the cemetery, visited it alone in the dead of night for the purposes of prosecuting his inquiries on that fearful subject. As he opened the trapdoor of the vault, a light burst from below, but deeming it to be only the lamp of the sacristan, the monk drew back and awaited his departure, concealed behind the high altar. The sacristan emerged not, however, from the opening, and the monk, tired of waiting, approached, and finally descended the rugged steps which led into the dreary depths. No sooner had he set foot on the lowermost stair than the well-known scene underwent a complete transformation in his eyes. He had long been accustomed to visit the vault, and whenever the sacristan went thither, he was almost sure to be with him. He therefore knew every part of it, as well as he did the interior of his own narrow cell, and the arrangement of its contents was perfectly familiar to his eyes. What then was his horror to perceive that this arrangement, which even but that morning had come under his observation as usual, was altogether altered, and a new and wonderful one substituted in its stead. A dim, lurid light pervaded the desolate abode of darkness, and it just sufficed to give to his view a sight of the most singular description. On each side of him, the dead but imperishable bodies of the long-buried brothers of the convent sat erect in their lidless coffins, their cold, starry eyes glaring at him with lifeless rigidity, their withered fingers locked together on their breasts, their stiffened limbs motionless and still. It was a sight to petrify the stoutest heart, and the monks quailed before it. Though he was a philosopher, and a skeptic to boot, at the upper end of the vault, at a rude table formed of a decaying coffin, or something which once served the same purpose, sat 3 monks. They were the oldest corses in the Channel House, and the inquisitive brother knew their faces well, and the cadaverous hue of their cheeks seemed still more cadaverous in the dim light shed upon them, while their hollow eyes gave forth what looked to him like flashes of flame. A large book lay open before one of them, and the others bent over the rotten table as if in intense pain or in a deep, fixed attention. No word was said. No sound was heard. The vault was as silent as the grave, its awful tenants still as statues. Fain would the curious monk have receded from this horrible place. Fain would he have retraced his steps and sought again his cell. Fain would he have shut his eyes to the fearful scene, but he could not stir from the spot. He felt rooted there. And though he once succeeded in turning his eyes to the entrance of the vault, To his infinite surprise and dismay, he could not discover where it lay, nor perceive any possible means of exit. He stood thus for some time. At length, the aged monk at the table beckoned him to advance. With slow, tottering steps, he made his way to the group, and at length stood in front of the table. While the other monks raised their heads and glanced at him with a fixed, lifeless look that froze the current of his blood, he knew not what to do. His senses were fast forsaking him. Heaven seemed to have deserted him for his incredulity. In this moment of doubt and fear, he bethought him of a prayer, and as he proceeded, he felt himself becoming possessed of a confidence he had before unknown. He looked at the book before him. It was a large volume, bound in black, and clasped with bands of gold, with fastenings of the same metal. It was inscribed at the top of each page, Liber Obedientiae. He could read no further. He then looked, first in the eyes of him before whom it lay open, and then in those of his fellows. He finally glanced around the vault on the corpses, who filled every visible coffin in its dark and spacious womb. Speech came to him, and resolution to use it. He addressed himself to the awful beings in whose presence he stood, in the words of one having authority with them. Pax vobis, 'twas thus he spake, peace be to ye. Hic nulla pax, replied an aged monk, in a hollow, tremulous tone, baring his breast the while. Here is no peace. He pointed to his bosom as he spoke, and the monk, casting his eye upon it, beheld his heart, within surrounded by living fire, which seemed to feed on it, but not consume it. He turned away in affright, but ceased not to prosecute his inquiries. Pax vobis in nomine Domini, he spake again. Peace be to ye, in the name of the Lord. Hic non pax, the hollow and heart-rending tones of the ancient monk, who sat at the right of the table, were heard to answer. Once glancing at the bared bosom of this hapless being, also the same sight was exhibited. The heart surrounded by a devouring flame, but still remaining fresh and unconsumed under its operation. Once more the monk turned away and addressed the aged man in the center. Pax vobis in nomine Domini, he proceeded. At these words, the being to whom they were addressed raised his head, put forward his hand, and closing the book with a loud clap, said, Speak on. It is yours to ask, and mine to answer. The monk felt reassured, and his courage rose with the occasion. Who are ye? He inquired. Who may ye be? We know not, was the answer. Alas, we know not. We know not, we know not, echoed in melancholy tones the denizens of the vault. What do ye here? Pursued the querist. We await the last day, the day of the last judgment. Alas for us, woe, woe. Woe, woe, resounded on all sides. The monk was appalled, but still he proceeded. What did ye to deserve such doom as this? What may your crime be that deserves such dole and sorrow? As he asked the question, the earth shook under him, and a crowd of skeletons uprose from a range of graves, which yawned suddenly at his feet. These are our victims, answered the old monk. They suffered at our hands. We suffer now, while they are at peace, and we shall suffer. For how long? Asked the monk. Forever and ever, was the answer. Forever and ever, forever and ever, died along the vault. May God have mercy on us, was all the monk could exclaim. The skeletons vanished, the graves closing over them. The aged men disappeared from his view, the bodies fell back into their coffins, the light fled, and the den of death was once more enveloped in its usual darkness. On the monk's revival, he found himself lying at the foot of the altar. The gray dawn of a spring morning was visible, and he was fain to retire to his cell as secretly as he could, for fear he should be discovered. From thenceforth he eschewed vain philosophy, says the legend, and devoting his time to the pursuit of true knowledge and the extension of the power, greatness, and glory of the Church, died in the odor of sanctity, and was buried in that holy vault, where his body is still visible. Requiescat in pace. The White Maiden. It is now centuries since a young noble of the neighborhood was hunting in the valleys which lie behind the hills that skirt the Rhine, opposite the ancient town of St. Goar. In the heat of the pursuit, he followed the game to the foot of the acclivity on which are seated the ruins of Thurnberg, and there it disappeared all at once from his view. It was the noon of Midsummer Day, and the sun shone down upon him with all its strength. Despairing of being able to find the object of his pursuit, he determined to clamber up the steep hillside, and seek shelter and repose in the shadow of the old castle, or mayhap in one of its many crumbling chambers. With much labor he succeeded in reaching the summit, and there, fatigued with his toil, and parched with a burning thirst, he flung himself on the ground beneath one of the huge towers, some of whose remains still rear their heads on high, and stretched out his tired limbs in the full enjoyment of rest. "Now," said he, as he wiped the perspiration from his brow, "now could I be happy indeed, if some kind being would bring me a beaker of cool wine, which they say is ages old, down there in the cellars of this castle." He had scarce spoken the words, when the most beautiful maiden stepped forth from a cleft in the ivy-covered ruin, bearing in one hand a huge silver beaker of an antique form, full to the very brim of foaming wine. In her other hand she held a large bunch of keys of all sizes. She was clad in white from head to foot, her hair was flaxen, her skin was like a lily, and she had such loving eyes that they at once won the heart of the young noble. "Here," said she, handing him the beaker, "thy wish is granted. Drink and be satisfied." His heart leaped within him with joy at her condescension, and he emptied the contents of the goblet in a single draught. All the while she looked at him in such a manner as to intoxicate his very soul, so kindly and confidential were her glances. The wine coursed through his veins like liquid fire. His heart soon burned with love for the maiden, and the fever of his blood was by no means appeased by the furtive looks which ever and anon she cast upon him. She apparently read his state of mind, and when his passion was at its highest pitch, and all restraint seemed put to an end by the potent effects of love and wine, she disappeared in a moment by the way she came. The noble rushed after her in the hope of detaining the fugitive, or at least of catching a partial glimpse of her retreating form, but the ivy-encircled cleft through which she seemed to have flitted looked as though it had not been disturbed for centuries, and as he tried to force his way to the gloomy cavern below, a crowd of bats and owls and other foul birds of evil omen, aroused from their repose, rose upward, and amidst dismal hootings and fearful cries, almost flung him backward with the violence of their flight. He spent the remainder of the afternoon in search of the lost one, but without success. At the coming of night, he wended his way homeward, weary, heartsick, and overwhelmed with an indefinable sensation of sadness. From that day forth, he was an altered man, altered in appearance as well as in mind and in manners. Pleasure was a stranger to his soul, and he knew no longer what it was to enjoy peace. Wherever he went, whatever pursuit he was engaged in, whether in the chase, in the hall, in lady's bower, or in chapel, his eye only saw one object, the white maiden. At the board she stood in imagination always before him, offering to his fevered lips the cool, brimming beaker, and in the long-drawn aisles of the chapel she was ever present, beckoning him from his devotions to partake of the generous beverage which she still bore in her right hand. Every matron or maiden he met seemed by some wondrous process to take her shape, and even the very trees of the forest all looked to his thought like her. Thenceforward, he commenced to haunt the ruins in which she had appeared to him, still hoping to see, once again, her for whom he felt he was dying, and living alone in that hope. The sun scorched him, but it was nothing to the fever that burned within him. The rain drenched him, but he cared not for it. Time and change and circumstance seemed all forgotten by him. Everything passed by him unheeded. His whole existence was completely swallowed up in one thought, the white maiden of the ruined castle, and that, alas, was the only vexation of spirit. A deadly fever seized him. It was a mortal disease. Still he raved in his delirium, but of her. One morn, a woodman, who occasionally provided him with food, found him a corpse at the entrance of the crevice in the wall whence the maiden had seemed to come, and where she had disappeared. It was long rumored that he had struggled bravely with death, or rather that he could not die, because the curse was upon him, until the maiden, garbed in white as usual, appeared to him once more. That then he stretched forth his hands, she stooped over him, he raised his head, she kissed his lips, and he died. The White Maiden, tradition says, has not since been seen in the ruins of Thurnberg. I hope you enjoyed these tales as much as I did. Join me next time to explore German traditions through a few fables and cautionary tales.